restoring the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint. With us today is Mr. Harry Campbell. He's the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So Harry's responsible for providing leadership and direction for the Pennsylvania office and leading CDF's environmental policy and advocacy agenda in Pennsylvania. Harry has over 10 years of experience in comprehensive watershed planning, PPL establishment and implementation planning, structural and non-structural stormwater BMPs, land use planning, public education, and water quality studies. Harry is the author of Michigan's Guide to Watershed Planning to Meet TMDL Goals. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Resource Management and a Master of Science in Environmental Pollution Control from the Pennsylvania State University. So we've got a great expert to share what's happening with the Bay and Chesapeake Bay's response to it. With that, Harry, thank you.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everybody for taking the time today to learn a little bit about what's going on in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. A watershed, actually, the vast majority of us actually live in, whether or not we recognize it. And a watershed that has been the focus of national initiatives for the better part of 30 years. Actually, I couldn't drive when the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement was actually established. I can drive now, obviously. Well, maybe not so well, but regardless of that fact, I can drive legally. And so we are in a different world today than we were back then. And so hopefully this conversation will introduce a topic of something of importance not only to us as individuals, as citizens of the Bay watershed, if we happen to live within that, as Pennsylvanians, but then you as professionals. Because in many regards, what we were talking about involves you on all of those scales. And it needs you on all of those scales. And this conversation is really part one of two. And my colleague, Bruce Crocker, who's in the room today, a senior scientist in the Pennsylvania office, will sort of be jumping off, hopefully, where I leave off in this conversation about some of the issues, particularly the green infrastructure-related items of this topic. So many of you already know this, but obviously the vast majority of the Earth is made up of water. Only a third, roughly, of the Earth is actually a landmass. But of that water, that vast amount of ocean and ice caps that we see in this graphic, only about 2.5% of that water in the entire Earth is fresh. And of that, less than 0.8% is surface water. Now we rely a heck of a lot on surface water, whether it be fresh or brackish. We rely on it for our economies, for food, for our cultures. We rely upon it for our industry. $7 trillion of economic activity is related to industrial activity in the waters of the United States. We rely upon it for our food. Agriculture relies on fresh and clean and plentiful drinking water, not only for cows, in this graphic, they are all surrounded by a watering source and drinking that water on a hot summer day. But we rely upon that water for irrigation of crops, to grow grain and corn and soybeans and other things that become part of our food network that is so important for the United States. And we rely upon it for our quality of life. In fact, over $2.5 billion of direct economic activity is associated with water-related recreation in the state of Pennsylvania alone, each and every year. Over 80,000 jobs are directly related to water resources in the state of Pennsylvania. Our economy is intricately linked to clean, fresh, and abundant surface water in the state of Pennsylvania. But waters do something else. And what they do is they reflect back to us the health and condition of how we treat the land. What we do, our daily decision-making, how we live our lives, the things that our governments, from the federal, the state, the local, down to our individual decision-making, is reflected back to us in our waters. The historical clear-cutting of Pennsylvania's forests had a demonstrable impact. And today, with the continued forest fragmentation and loss associated with commercial and residential development, along with resource extraction, continue to tick away at that. How we implement or manage agriculture by allowing cows direct access to stream in a passé example that oftentimes is all too common in certain parts of Pennsylvania, including Lancaster County, where cows are defecating and urinating, providing direct input of nutrients, of nitrogen and phosphorus, which become pollutants, but also of bacteria, which not only affects our health or increases our drinking water treatment costs. The majority of Pennsylvanians get their drinking water from surface waters, but also affects the herd health of the cows themselves. If you were down in this part of the stream and you were drinking that cow's excrement, you probably wouldn't be too happy, nor would you be too healthy. And that reduces the bottom line. The impacts, historical and current, of resource extraction, whether it be gravel, or the legacies of abandoned mine land drainage in the state of Pennsylvania, and certainly the specter of increased industrialization in more rural parts of Pennsylvania associated with the Marcellus shale industry, present a unique and difficult challenge even to this day. And of course, the continued fragmentation of our open spaces. Estimates indicate that from 1995 to 2002, Pennsylvania's population grew 4.5%, one of the lowest in the nation. The amount of developed land in Pennsylvania during that same time frame increased by over 130%. No other state in the nation had such a dichotomy under that analysis than the state of Pennsylvania. And the majority of that was actually occurring in some of our more rural landscapes. So these weren't development opportunities or developments that we're actually building upon and next to first green suburbs, but were rather in greenfield developments, oftentimes far flung in the middle of nowhere with no supporting infrastructure as it pertains to jobs, or even grocery stores, or supermarkets, or other things. And we're dealing with the legacy of antiquated and oftentimes unmaintained infrastructure. The state of Pennsylvania leads the nation in the number of individual discrete areas where raw sewage is discharged under heavy rain events. This is called combined sewer overflows. In the Susquehanna River watershed alone, along the river, there are over 400 discharge points where raw sewage can be found being discharged whenever there is a heavy rain in our boroughs or our communities. The city of Harrisburg has over 40 of these along the Susquehanna River. And then we think about the daily decisions as it pertains to, well, how I got here. Or how we all oftentimes commute to work, commute to the store, commute to wherever we are going. And the fact that air pollution becomes water pollution every time it rains. The water acts as, if you're an engineer of chemical engineering, or environmental engineering like myself, a trickling filter effect occurs. And what that means is that the pollution in the air is phase transferred into the water, oftentimes. And whether it be nitrogen oxides or volatile organic carbons, or even things that come from our brakes and from our tires, and oils and greases, they land on something, and oftentimes that impervious surface is not acting anything like a natural surface, and when it rains, it's either absorbed into the water, and then into the nearest receiving water body, or is picked up from an impervious surface, hitches a ride, and finds itself into the nearest river or stream. Now for us, we live within, and we're talking right now, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We're about right here in Lancaster County. The Chesapeake Bay watershed actually is 64,000 square miles in size. It actually starts at the Cooperstown, New York, where the initiation of the Susquehanna River starts. The Susquehanna River actually flows 444 miles to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. But this water body and this estuary was once the most productive estuary estimated ever to have existed on the face of the earth. It's very unique in the sense that prior to the landing of the last ice age, there was no Chesapeake Bay. In fact, there was just simply the Susquehanna River. And actually, you can actually see that in the bathymetric data, the underwater topographic profile. The riverbed of the Susquehanna River is actually the main shipping channels leading into Baltimore Harbor. When the last ice age receded about 10,000 years ago and sea level rise occurred, we saw the formation of what is known today as the Chesapeake Bay, forming a water body that has more shoreline than the entire west coast of the continental United States. Within those nooks and crannies that form the Chesapeake Bay, where all the life occurs. So unique was this water body that if you put it on a football field, the average depth would be the width of a quarter. It's shallow, it's wide, it's intricate. All of that together, along with the temperate environment in which it lies, resulted in it being one of the most productive water bodies ever to have known. And in fact, when Captain John Smith first laid eyes upon the Chesapeake Bay in the 1400s, he was quoted as saying, and I'll probably misquote it, but that heaven and earth has never seen such a perfect example for the habitation of man than this water body. Oysters the size of basketballs were reported to have existed in the bay at that point in time. The other unique factor is that no other water body in the entire world has the land-to-water ratio as the Chesapeake Bay. We talked about the influence of land reflecting back, water reflecting back how we treat the land. No other water body in the world has the land and water ratio that the Chesapeake Bay has. So, unlike other water bodies, whether it be the Sea of Japan, or the Mediterranean, or the Gulf of California, whatever it is, no other water body is so influenced by the health and condition of the land than the Chesapeake Bay. This has resulted in things like the crab population, which was euphoric and integral to the economies of the Chesapeake Bay, and the overfishing and use of that actually becoming a significant concern as it pertains to being unsustainable. Today, the oyster population is roughly 1/100th of what it once was. 100 years ago, or excuse me, in the 1800s, there were 100 oysters per square yard roughly. Now there's just one. Those oysters could filter the entire water in the Chesapeake Bay in 3 days. Now it's over 100. And we've lost 99% of that population due to overfishing and pollution. Menhaden and other fisheries are significantly impacted and being overstripped or overfished rather, in the Chesapeake Bay. Menhaden, which are referenced as the fundamental food source for just about any other aquatic organism above a crab and an oyster, above the plankton, in the fisheries realm, it is the fundamental protein source for other fish, like striped bass, economic activity, fish that are heavily relied upon for gaming opportunities. And we have conditions where people actually are suffering deleterious impacts of infections associated with the health condition of our waters, including the Chesapeake Bay. Today, on the average year, a significant proportion of the Chesapeake Bay in the summer is considered a dead zone. And a dead zone is essentially an area, particularly the bottom of that water body, that does not have enough oxygen to sustain life. In some cases, there's a little bit of oxygen. In other cases, there's absolutely no oxygen. A complete dead zone. Only certain types of worms that can burrow underground will survive. So if you are an aquatic organism, you either run to get out of the way, or if you're an oyster who happens to be on an oyster bar and you're stationary, you're at the whim of this moving dead zone. This is like the Blob. Think of it as the Blob, that 1950s movie. It's not stationary. It comes and goes. It forms. It moves. It's a living thing in many ways, like an amoeba. And as such, one day the water may look good. The next day, you may not see healthy conditions. And in some cases, when this pushes up against critical habitat within the areas, things that live in the water jump out because there's more oxygen in the air than there is in the water. That's like us jumping in the pool to try to breathe. So how does this happen? What happens because, at least in terms of Pennsylvania, of which 2/3 drains to the Chesapeake Bay, the Susquehanna River being the largest source of fresh water to the Chesapeake Bay, is because of the health and condition of our rivers and streams in our own backyard. 18,000 miles of Pennsylvania's rivers and streams do not meet basic water quality standards. In some cases, there is simply very little, if not nothing, existing in them. No living life that is discernible to the human eye. Agriculture is the #1 source of impairment in the state of Pennsylvania. Conditions such as this, or those cows in those streams, as well as the sediment that comes from those streams, the nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are good in small amounts, bad in big, result in problems within these streams that result in significant impacts in terms of the chemistry, the biology, the physical habitat of those streams to the degree to which they do not meet the spirit and intent and the technical details associated with clean water. The legacy of acid mine drainage, pHs below stomach acid, in some cases, are being discharged into our streams, resulting in absolutely nothing that is naked to the human eye. Living within those streams is the second leading cause of impairment. And urban and suburban stormwater runoff, the third leading cause and the only cause of pollution within the Chesapeake Bay watershed to actually be increasing, which is probably not a surprise. But we see the impacts not only in the Chesapeake Bay, the Susquehanna River, in many cases, although science is still trying to figure it out, is suffering as well. These are smallmouth bass in the lower portion of Susquehanna River. These are lesions. Lesions, ulcers, that have resulted in the fish actually dying, becoming diseased and dying. In the lower Susquehanna River, U.S. Geological Surveys indicate that over 90% of the male fish are producing female eggs. Why is this occurring? The science is still trying to figure out if there is a smoking gun, or if it's the perfect storm of a number of different impacts that are stressing out those fish, resulting in not only susceptibility to disease, but in some cases the actual hermaphroditic changeover, intersex species occurring, males turning into females, essentially due to, for instance, personal care products and pharmaceuticals from wastewater treatment plants and agricultural operations, and manure applied onto the landscape. We also see in the last 15 years a significant increase in a type of algae that is occurring in the lower Susquehanna River, which had not been present to the spatial degree and extent that it had been previously. A type of filamentous algae that is essentially is like angel hair. It's hair, it's a mat of wet hair within the river system itself. And these have been exploding in population growth over the last 10 years. These type of algae, which is a caudoforia, is actually associated with eutrophication, excessive amounts of dissolved inorganic phosphorus and nitrogen population as well. The same things that result in the Chesapeake Bay having dead zones. And in some rain events, you can actually see the impact of the Susquehanna River, the negative impact, for well over 100 miles in the Chesapeake Bay. That chocolate milk vein that you see there is the Susquehanna River. And the sediment plume extending over almost 100 miles in length, well past Baltimore Harbor and into the Potomac, down past the Potomac. I ran some numbers associated with this particular rain event, and it was the equivalent of, if I did my math correctly, about 3,700 miles of dump trucks lined up end to end, dumping sediment or dirt into the Chesapeake Bay from the Susquehanna River. That's like almost from here to California. From one heavy rain event. From Pennsylvania. Overall, aggregately, if you look at Pennsylvania's influence on the Chesapeake Bay in terms of the three major pollutants of concern, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, you're seeing that it's the usual suspects, as we noted earlier, as it pertains to the stream impairments. Agricultural runoff is a big portion of that, as well as urban and suburban stormwater runoff, point sources, and even to the surprise of many forests. Forests that are good. We want to plant trees, and we want to preserve our forest cover grants. Why would that be? And it's often pointed as, well, maybe we should be clear-cutting more. In fact, that number is actually representing an anthropogenically influenced exacerbation of the nitrogen load, meaning it's the human-influenced nitrogen load. For roughly 98% of that load is actually from atmospheric deposition from coal-fired plants all the way up into the western United States of Michigan, size 64,000 square miles, 6 times greater than that. Michigan, Georgia, Tennessee, those coal plants, electric plants, emit in a far-field effect nitrogen oxides that deposit onto the landscape in Pennsylvania that result in an exacerbation of the forest load. It's coming from the forest load, but it's not actually forest load itself. It's atmospheric deposition of nitrogen onto the forest floor. We also see that nitrogen actually, and the acid rain that we still are challenged with, associated with that, causes leaching of nitrogen from forest floors and soils at a higher rate than normal as well, thus adding additional factor to that. For phosphorus, a similar scenario, except that we see that urban stormwater, both in terms of the urban core, like downtown Harrisburg, downtown Lancaster, versus the non-urban stormwater, which we consider from the suburbs, and those far-flung developments outside of that construct of what's known as an MS4, are a big portion of that, along with the wastewater treatment plants within the Susquehanna River Basin, of which there are over 200 that are discharging into the Susquehanna River. And from sediments, we see a smaller number of source sectors, but agriculture being the most dominating of those source sectors that are dealing with that. In addition to that, that also includes that stream bank erosion that you saw, for instance, with that picture of that agricultural landscape. So that's not only overland flow, but also the erosion of the stream bed and bank associated with the land use adjacent to those areas. And of course, this is that actual size of that 64,000 square mile watershed juxtaposed to the airshed, which is 6 times larger. And in fact, when we think about air pollution, recently, a couple of years ago, the Patriot News highlighted that South Central Pennsylvania suffers from some of the worst air pollution in the entire United States. And that challenge, whether it be from ozone, is certainly, and particulate matter, is correlated to nitrogen oxides, which form with VOCs to form that ozone during sunny, hot day events. Where does this all spatially come from? The bullseye on the map is South Central Pennsylvania for us, as well as the Wilkes-Barre Scranton area, and of course the DC Metro, Shenandoah Valley, and the eastern shore of Maryland. Generally, the Conestoga River watershed actually, and this is a few years old, so I hesitate, but there was rough estimates that the Conestoga River watershed, which drains a large portion of Lancaster County, represented less than 10% of the landmass, but actually contributed over 12% of the load of nitrogen entering into the Chesapeake Bay from that 64,000 square mile area. So the influence of this South Central Pennsylvania, where you have the intersection of heavy and historical agriculture and animal use-based agriculture, along with population growth for new sources, and the antiquated infrastructure associated with CSOs and point source discharges, along with, we're sort of like a bowl or a pot, and a lot of that air pollution settles in these areas. All of that combines to form a perfect storm of pollution in terms of where it's coming from for nitrogen and phosphorus primarily entering into the Chesapeake Bay. And therefore why such heavy emphasis has been placed on that area for the restoration, which is achievable. The restoration of the Chesapeake Bay is achievable. We want to go from the degradation cycle, which we've been experiencing for the past 50, 60 years, where heavy sediments and nutrients cause algal blooms that result in the blocking out of sunlight, the killing off of submerged aquatic vegetation, which are nature's reoxygenators, and the smothering of that vegetation along with key habitats that are part of that aquatic matrix that are important for oysters, important for small young and eater fish, and important for crabs. This, going from that cycle to this, the restoration cycle, is what is predicated on the efforts to restore the bay, which is based on the Clean Water Act, which was established in 1972, and said that by 1987 we wanted to have all waters within the United States fishable and swimmable. Obviously we're not there yet. But these standards have developed, resulted in, after 30 years of effort, the development of what is known as a TMDL, a very scientific and quantitative analysis of saying how much pollution is too much for the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. And it breaks it up by wastewater allocations, which are from point sources, stormwater, as well as treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, and industrial wastewater treatment plants, as well as load allocations, which are from the non-point source sector, and actually goes through a very detailed quantitative scientific analysis that takes years in terms of developing, and which happened for us in 2011 for the Chesapeake Bay watershed, based on those 30 years of effort. The watershed, the TMDL itself, is actually 92 individual TMDLs, mostly for the Susquehanna River, and then for a large number of small tidal water basins that are also impaired within the lower portion of Maryland. From that, from the Bay TMDL, an executive order from President Obama, and then Clean Water Act authorities, the development of watershed implementation plans for each of those watersheds was initiated by each of the individual states based on a negotiated allocation of load reductions. And those load reductions were associated with, we are here, we got to get there. But the other side of the equation is that once we get there, we have to maintain it in perpetuity. So as land use changes, as population changes, as society changes, we have to maintain those load reductions. So with federal leadership starting in early 2010, there was a number of things that actually occurred, including consequences associated with inaction or in development. And now we've developed in 2010 the phase 1 watershed implementation plans. Pennsylvania developed a phase 2. They're now starting, or will be starting for 2017, a phase 3. Each one incrementally building upon the other to assure continued implementation with the target goal of achieving implementation of best management practices on the ground to achieve load reductions associated with the WIP by 2025. So we need to get to where we need to go by 2025 in this effort. And along with that, there's some conditions as it pertains to what if we don't. And we could talk about those, but I'll skip over that because there are things like, for instance, whether or not MPDS permits need to be expanded upon or have further implementation, as well as getting down to a finer scale. Require net improvement offsets, so every new development possibly including an improvement associated with overall stormwater load, let alone just achieving the baseline standard. We're halfway there, about. We started in 1985 for Pennsylvania, for all of the Bay watershed, at discharging in nitrogen, which is the most significant one to be reduced, at roughly 320 million pounds. Today we're at about that level. So we're halfway there. And by 2025 for Pennsylvania, we started here and we've gotten to about here during that period of time from 1985 to 2011. So we've made improvement. The lion's share of that improvement has come from the agricultural sector. We can't ignore these other source sectors. And so there's a greater emphasis now in maintaining momentum here and increasing or stemming the tide of increases in some cases from the other source sectors, because we've got to get to here. And for nitrogen, this looks like this in a different way. So you've actually seen, well, we've still got a lot of work to do, but agriculture has done the vast majority of the load reductions associated with nitrogen, while on the other side of the equation, some folks have actually been increasing their load from nitrogen. And so they even have further ways to go from pervious surface stormwater runoff, like from lawns or cultivated agricultural fields, and things, or excuse me, athletic fields and other. And we've actually seen a minuscule increase in pervious surface as well as in wastewater treatment plants during that period of time. The percent change is another way to look at this as well. And what we see is that in terms of construction, stormwater runoff, erosion and sedimentation control results have had a significant impact as we've improved those requirements, but we've seen that as a proportion of the percentage of load, septic systems are increasing at a concerning rate. Even though they represent a relatively small percentage of the overall total load, less than 4%, the percentage of increase over time from 1985, due to land use change primarily, is resulting in that percent change increase. For phosphorus, it's a similar scenario, same story, different pollutant. We can see the same sort of breakdown, except for this, the case municipal wastewater treatment plants have really stepped up to the plate during that interim period of time, largely based on local TMDLs as well as things that they can do in terms of flocculation, adding chemicals to the wastewater treatment plant discharge that removes phosphorus physically from the waste stream. percentage breakdown similar, except for this case, the pervious is actually increasing in the sense that that's for lawn fertilizer mostly. And so as we've grown the number of lawns, lawn being the largest cultivated crop in Lancaster County, as well as central Pennsylvania, as those have grown, so has the proportion of the management of them and the load associated with them. And sediment is a similar tale as well. The last major pollutant, except that you see the breakdown is a little bit different based on source sector, but we still have demonstrable effort to go to reach that 2025 goal. It looks like nitrogen a little bit more than phosphorus in this regard, although phosphorus and sediment are highly integrated related because phosphorus oftentimes binds to sediment. And so you don't see too much free-form unassociated phosphorus within an aquatic ecosystem because it's associated almost by 80% with the sediment of some sort. And municipal wastewater treatment plants through TSS, total suspended solids, have done an admirable job along with construction and agriculture. But again, there we see a pervious increase. So to achieve these load reductions, we need to do more of what we've been doing, and that's certainly preserving our key high-quality water in the state of Pennsylvania, our special protection streams, which are mostly focused in the northern central part of the state. That water, as it reaches the more densely populated areas, as well as the areas that are influenced by heavy agriculture, if we are not having clean and fresh water to the degree that we are, by the time it reaches those areas, our challenge becomes even greater because we're starting at a lower baseline. So we need to preserve where we have clean water. We need to invest in our infrastructure, obviously. Whether it be in terms of point source discharge infrastructure and instituting BNR or nutrient reduction technologies, biological nutrient reduction technologies, as well as infrastructure associated with CSOs, combined sewer overflows, to stem that tide, to deal with that issue along with stormwater. Preserving agriculture to assure that those working landscapes can go back, can be preserved, and in some cases even enhanced, so as to be lowering their pollution reduction influence, or lowering their pollution reduction rather, increasing their pollution reduction through the implementation of various practices, while preventing the conversion of that landscape is a key component to the overall effort. And then restoring those landscapes, and this is an example of an agricultural field that has a forested riparian buffer, streamside forest, where we purposefully plant trees, shrubs, and grasses to a prescribed way, fence out cattle, provide an alternative crossing, as well as water source, which you saw way back at the beginning. So now there's no need for the cows to be in the streams, because they have all the water they need, and crossings. If the same farmer owns the farm field over here and over there, they can cross over without causing problems within the stream, or minimizing those problems. And any manure or any nutrients that are actually applied onto this field, because of this filtering strip, is actually captured and then removed or kept on the farm field. And research indicates that those streams that are actually adjacent to a forested riparian buffer remove 8 times more nitrogen and over 5 times more phosphorus in the stream itself, in an in situ naturalized stream cleansing process, and actually break down atrazine at a far greater rate than non-forested streams. Atrazine being a toxic chemical of concern that's oftentimes applied onto farm fields. Why? Because of increased metabolic activity based on the biology within that stream. And the Pennsylvania Office of CDF has really taken that mantra and worked with over 5,000 landowners to implement practices such as that. And this one actually in Lancaster County is not too far from here. This is the stream in 1997. It doesn't look so bad, but there was some activity, obviously some spoil here from sediments and things of that nature, housing development in the background. But we came in and utilizing a very prescribed methodology that's established in the scientific literature and in guidance for the state of Pennsylvania. We restored the stream to place a forested riparian buffer on it. And that is 1997, that's 2012. Same stream, same location. You can see there's the bridge abutment. So before, that's after. So what this does, obviously this improves the health and condition of the stream, and hopefully it improves the visual quality of the stream. And this stream now, before, didn't have naturally reproducing brook trout. Today it does. Brook trout Pennsylvania's fishing. It's our state designated fish. It's a significant economic driver for our rural communities. Pennsylvania has some of the best brook trout streams in the entire world. People flock from all over the world to fish Pennsylvania stream for brook trout. This stream has them. But it also includes green infrastructure, the things that you folks know about, and Ruth will be talking about specifically as well, whether it be rain gardens in our suburban and urban landscapes, it's plantings, it's soil amendments, it's green roofs, it's cisterns, rain barrels, porous pavements, a whole aggregation of different pest management practices put together in a format that not only achieves water improvement and stormwater abatement and filtration, enhancing that physical, chemical, and biological removal processes by allowing the water droplet to hit nature before it hits the stream, is the predication of this effort. But it also includes incorporating it into things like revitalization. Like this borough of Lemoyne, which is doing a downtown revitalization effort in their Main Street corridor that incorporates green infrastructure, including these little buttons that they've done to design and capture street runoff. It's a heavily sloped area not represented by these photographs. But what they are doing is in a systematic way, as it's going towards the Susquehanna River, is providing these green streets technologies, if you want to call it that, for opportunities to intercept stormwater at discrete locations throughout the area. And so there's little curb cuts and overflow areas that allow for, as that is going down towards the river, it's capturing stormwater and treating it and holding it back, providing volume control as well as pollutant removal throughout. And it includes the Paxton Creek watershed area where folks are dealing with parking lots and rooftop runoff, and in this case, the farm show, where not only did they install a rain garden to capture rooftop runoff, but also behind this is the parking lot on the northern side. But the soils were so poor in this area that they needed to have a soil amendment for obvious reasons. It was compacted, it was stripped of all organic matter. It was really just lawn with a very small root structure on top of it. Well, through a project that CBF was working on, we were able to actually provide that soil amendment in the form of an agricultural waste product. A manure, poultry litter, and dairy manure compost that dealt with an agricultural excess or waste product, composted it, and provided a stormwater abatement practice for stormwater. And then the design engineer provided the overall engineering and planning associated with that. Obviously, people are familiar with the Green City and Clean Waters program in Philadelphia at a large scale, but in Lancaster County, there's efforts as well to green the city, to deal with not only the quality of life issues, to provide greenery and attractiveness to the city, but to deal with these very issues as well, to provide that clean water opportunity. All of this comes together to represent the time for the Chesapeake Bay, for our recreation opportunities, for our fishing opportunities, and quite frankly, for our quality of life. And I don't know. Well, that's my story. Thank you.
So we've got plenty of time for any questions. Feel free. We've also got a survey that I'll pass around. If you please fill it out. We'd love to have your feedback. And if this one.
Why are you doing that? In the meantime, are there any questions or concerns? Yes.
A few years ago, there was a mention of possible pollution reduction credits on an order of renewable energy. So a couple of articles about it, and then Louisiana energy. Is that still being thought about?
Yeah, Pennsylvania, and I'm trying to remember the exact date. It's probably about 5 years old now, established what is known as a nutrient trading program. And it's applicable across the state. but it's really predicated on the Chesapeake Bay requirements. And its fundamental construct is that to alleviate some of the challenges associated and the costs associated with improving the discharges from point sources, primarily sewage treatment plants, that we could get the same pollution reductions at a lower cost from agricultural operations if they went above and beyond what they're already required to do. And so the program is based on that construct where farmers will voluntarily implement various different practices and then submit approval to the department, and then they get credit that they can then sell to a buyer on a market basis. And it's been a challenge. It's worked in some areas, it's worked in some applications. What has been sort of the challenge to get it really operational at a large scale has been focused on demand. And while a lot of wastewater treatment plants have this requirement, when they look at the costs, they have to oftentimes borrow money regardless or raise rates regardless in some cases. And if they're going to be doing that, oftentimes they're like, well, shouldn't we invest in something that at the end of the day we own? Because if we're borrowing money from the bond market and we don't own that credit, it's like taking out a mortgage to rent an apartment. At the end of the day, you don't own it. And so they've sort of, a lot of them have made the decision that, well, why don't we just buy this thing, amortize it for 30 years, own it at the end of the day, and then we have collateral. We have an investment that we can use. But in some cases, wastewater treatment plants of a certain size, particularly smaller ones, may not be able to do that very well, and so they've gone to the wastewater treatment market, the nutrient trading market. Simultaneous to the time that the trading program was established, the housing market kind of stagnated, if you want to call it that, but certainly the bottom fell out from up there. We didn't see a lot of development occurring within that period of time, particularly outside of sewer service areas. And in Pennsylvania's requirements, there's one little component that if you're outside a sewer service area and you're actually building what's known as a package plant, you have to achieve for that discharge a no net increase from that sewage treatment plant discharge. And so that would drive demand if there was a lot of development occurring outside of sewer service areas, because then those developers would have to buy those credits to offset that on an annual basis in perpetuity. But we haven't seen that yet, or return to what is expected value would be. So yes, there is a program, a nutrient trading program. It's going through improvements right now. The State Department of Environmental Protection is working on ways to improve it. We sit on that work group to help with those challenges. But it's very technically complex and regulatorily challenging to deal with. Yes?
Well, I'm from Lancaster County, and I hear the farmers complaining all the time about what they have to do. I mean, a lot of them understand and buy into it, but it's expensive and costly for a lot of them. But this has been happening for a while yet. Are we seeing any significant improvements in the water and the bay health with what they've been doing?
Good question. And I should have included that. Not only have we been doing the implementation and associated with load reductions, but the bay is actually responding. Now, technically it's challenging because it's sort of like, let's use the equivalent of like a boxer, if you will. You know, we knocked them down, but then we've been kicking them. And the bay has been knocked down. It got knocked down in the 1970s. And then for the last several decades, from the 1970s to the mid-1980s, we just kind of kept kicking it while it was down. And now that we've started to try to help it back up, there's a lag time associated with that. And you got to help it back up slowly. So everything that we've done incrementally, both as a state of Pennsylvania, but overall with all the other bay states, has been helping. But it's getting better, and we see the dead zones shrinking both And there was a recent report just out yesterday that said the dead zone length of time each summer is actually shrinking. And other reports are indicating that it's shrinking in size and intensity because of some of these efforts. But what the scientists have hypothesized is that there's an inflection point. And what we're starting to see is that the system itself is gaining self-sustaining momentum, meaning it's been beaten down for so long, so hard, that it's taken a while, each incremental improvement has taken a while to build upon itself. When you plant a tree or establish a forest riparian buffer, it's not going to have that great of an impact on day one. But 15 years later, it will. And so a lot of these vegetative practices take time to actually fully maturate in the landscape. And we're seeing some of the return on the investments of 10 years ago now today in the form of the Chesapeake Bay. So yes, we are seeing momentum, we're seeing improvement. And the science bears that out each and every year now for the last several years. Good point, thank you.
When I'm going to Ocean City, Maryland, I see signs saying entering watershed or leaving watershed. Is that just for informational purposes? Is there a game plan or things that people should be doing?
It's mostly, obviously, that's for recognition, educational purposes, awareness. A lot of folks may not even recognize what a watershed is. My in-laws at one point, a couple of years ago, said, what does that actually mean? And their daughter's an aquatic ecologist, and one would hypothesize that they probably would know what a watershed is. And obviously I'm married to her, so I deal with these sort of things. It's really informational and awareness purposes that you're entering an area where snowmelt, groundwater discharge, or a rain drop goes to the Delaware versus the Chesapeake at a certain point in the topography. It's like the continental divide, except it's the watershed divide. For the Chesapeake Bay, we have this big construct and this big initiative because of the challenges with the bay. If you look at a satellite image of the Delaware, it is fundamentally different in size and structure. And the same amount of pollution in the Delaware may not affect the in the Chesapeake, may not affect the Delaware at all because of that structural differences. They're two fundamentally different water bodies. So you have Philadelphia and all the activities there not having as, if that were over right on the edge of the bay, you may see significant impacts. But you're not seeing that same impact necessarily in the Delaware because of that. So it's really going back to your original. Yeah, just educational purposes, awareness. You don't see this level of effort in the Delaware because they don't have the challenges yet associated with water quality in Chesapeake Bay in the Delaware.
Does the watershed go up into New York? And is that sort of like on the map? Is it like kind of Catskills area?
It breeds in a little bit into the Catskill areas, or the traditional areas that you would call the Catskills. I mean, the real quintessential point is in Cooperstown, New York, and the surrounding area there where the Susquehanna River starts, and you can literally jump over it. And just below, and just below the Finger Lakes areas. So the Finger Lakes, they drain north up to St. Lawrence River and all those, and everything below that drains to the south in the various rivers and streams that make up the Susquehanna River watershed, which is roughly 27,000 square miles in size. So it's a significant portion of the 64,000 square mile Chesapeake Bay watershed.
Talking about erosion before, is there any kind of projects that are going on to prevent the erosions from, around the bend while there's been a past, have the least resistance and a heavy storm event or runoff event? I know you're talking about installing buffers or whatever to prevent flumes from getting in, but what about water naturally carving out the side?
Yeah, like in a gully kind of scenario off the landscape. Yeah, so you want to actually start at the source if it's a natural development area. So you want to, in some cases, reduce the amount of runoff that's actually concentrating and forming that rill or gully erosion eventually. And if it's going towards a buffer, you want to try to keep it as a sheet erosion so that the buffer itself is not overwhelmed and starts to carve out that area, particularly underneath the tree canopy, where you may not have a lot of vegetated understory, particularly in a shore setting. So there you would look at maybe, if it's naturally occurring in those scenarios, You may look at certain types of engineered swales or other types of vegetated types of check dams and things of that nature that will slow down the water, hopefully allow for it to be distributed if it can be. If it can't be, then you want to give it little pockets of area where it can aggregate before it accelerates and erodes as it runs off into the waterway. And then whether that's an agricultural area or a urban-suburban area, or even in the case of like a forest area when we have a lot of steep slopes that naturally erode, and that's a natural process, particularly the concern that, you know, if you believe in it, but the global climate weirding and the associated precipitation changes, both in terms of intensity and duration, can exacerbate pollution sources like sediment in even naturalized conditions. And so do you have to do engineered types of practices? And there are, as part of our watershed implementation plan, certain practices to deal with that have been established. As well as dealing with the dirt and gravel roads that oftentimes crisscross those areas, exacerbating that very problem in some cases.
Without homeowners who want a nice lawn, do you have any sort of other options for them for fertilizing?
There are certainly more low-impact opportunities. So if you desire a lawn, you could do like I do and actually do nothing. I don't buy anything as far as fertilizer or herbicides or pesticides. But if you feel like it's an absolute necessity, there are more benign ways to go about it, organic-based approaches that have, rely on soil testing and more of that organic or naturalized kind of control that will hopefully achieve the same end result, but do it in a way that doesn't either over-apply or result in that running off. So slow release fertilizers, precision-based application during the growing season as opposed to just kind of doing it willy-nilly, more is better attitude. If you think about it a little bit further, do your homework, you can do a lot of different things. Even simply allowing grass clippings to naturally degrade increases over time the organic matter in those soils. And as that organic matter increases, the root structures can become more in depth and breaking through those bottom layers, reestablishing the sponge that the soil provides. And then also that becomes more drought tolerant and less addicted to fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. So you now have a more sustainable lines. And there's a lot of books and companies that actually specialize in doing that sort of conversion.
Along the line of lawns, I've seen actually some folks advertising this and haven't had any direct experience with it, but I've seen folks now advertising seed mixtures for lawns, right? They give you a much deeper root zone, and they've been kind of, I guess, engineered to basically it's kind of like a miniature tree or a miniature bush, right? They don't grow to the same extent that a lot of grasses are used on lawns to grow.
Yes.
Have you guys been looking at that? Have any experience with it? Is it something that's viable?
As far as research, I have not. I am aware of it. Oftentimes the term is thrown out there, no-grow, or a dwarf kind of species lawn. But yeah, it's very that sort of thing where they say you only have to cut this grass twice a year. And it requires little or no maintenance associated with it. It creates a thick, impenetrable layer, oftentimes for herbicides or for weeds and things like that. But I have not seen any research on the application. That's an interesting sidebar that I have not explored.
Yeah, the interesting part to me was if you look at like the native grasses, like on prairies and things like that, right? The root zone is 10 feet deep in some cases, like that, right? And our lawns are, a couple inches of that. So that would seem to me to be, if we can find alternatives to lawn that give kind of the same services with much better benefits.
I agree. Yeah.
I've seen it, I just wondered if you have any experience.
So we actually grow grass from Prairie Nursery. That's okay.
My house is Bayscape. I use the Bayscape principles and the native plants and what to put around the house and to break up the lawn. And in fact, last year we did a whole bunch of, we took a big part of lawn out and and put some native plants and grasses in there. And you do get a lot of runoff, and I have a stream at the end of my property. So I'm always yelling at my neighbors. But yeah, that works.
Yeah, and I live in a borough, but we have a unique scenario where it's almost a full acre in the backyard. We planted like 30-some trees and actually created a wildflower meadow in the back. I don't have any stream side, but forest or buffer may or may not work in certain scenarios, but thinking of alternative types of vegetation, like a wildflower meadow or other types of grasses, at least is better than typical turf grass right to the edge of water. So there's a lot of things that if you think about your landscape, where are the swales, where's the infiltration areas, that's where you can start to apply some of these concepts to accentuate them and hopefully make them your landscape more attractive and still usable to your end goal. So, and that's oftentimes a challenge. Hopefully, if you'll stick around to catch Ruth, who's in the back, to talk a little bit more minutia on some stormwater components and green infrastructure in more detail than I did here.